Hello, welcome back to another episode of Essential Dialogues with Teddy Allen. Always overjoyed that you take your time to spend with us to hear, we believe, really incredible information that's going to be helpful to help you on your walk. Before we go any further, subscribe. Just hit that subscribe button. Like and share as well. Nothing wrong with that. But subscribe. This allows us to keep in touch with you automatically when new episodes become available, and we do them about monthly for the most part. Today's guest is an incredible man that represents the North American division of Seventh-day Adventists in terms of legal affairs and also in terms of religious liberty. His name is Orlan Johnson, and he's going to speak to us today about how faith intersects with politics and the appropriate action of believers in light of the political environment that we live in. In other words, he's going to help us to understand what God expects from us in terms of being his representatives, his ambassadors within the political environments that exist around us. On top of that, I have a co-host that's going to help me go through this conversation and this dialogue with Elder Orlan Johnson. I cannot wait to introduce my co-host to you, but you just got to hang on just a little bit longer. And at the other side of this introduction, I will introduce our co-host, and he will introduce our guest, Brother Orlan Johnson. Thank you again for joining the conversation. We're always glad to have you. Hello, sorry for that long introduction. How are you all doing? Thanks again for joining us. Let's go straight to our co-host because he is a good friend of mine and he's also, in a way, my boss. With no further ado, our co-host is Brother Josh Pierre. He is a lawyer, but not a slimy, greasy one, thank God. He is the Associate General Counsel of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. And he's also the head elder at Capitol Hill Seventh-day Adventist Church. And that's how he is my boss, because I also am one of the lesser used elders there at Capitol Hill. With no further ado, will you join me in welcoming my good brother, Josh Pierre? Hello, boss. How are you?
Hey, Teddy. It's good to be with you this evening. How are you?
Man, I am doing well. I feel legally prepared, legally protected. I feel legally supported. Because not just is there one lawyer is good, I have learned. Good to have one good lawyer, but it's better to have two. Amen, somebody.
That's right.
With no further ado, you were going to introduce our special guest, Brother Orlan Johnson. Go ahead.
Yeah, we are so lucky to have a great guest this evening. He is a longtime friend of ours. He is the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty of Ministries for the North American Division. But the great thing about Orlan is that the Lord has used him to be a witness and to demonstrate his faith in Christ in some of the highest circles in the political arena. He has rubbed shoulders and contacted with local leaders, with governors, and even in the small circles of presidents of the United States. And so the Lord has used him to be an effective witness in some very high circles. And he is also a member of Capitol Hill. And more importantly, he is one of our powerful elders as well. So we are, as our pastor likes to say, peacock proud to introduce our own Orlan Johnson to this conversation this evening.
And there he is. What's up, O? How are you, sir?
I'm good, man. I appreciate all of the kind words. Almost didn't know who y'all were talking about, man. I don't hear y'all often, so it's good to be here, man.
I was just going to come in and chime in and say he's also North Amityville. Or are you from Central Amityville? But Amityville's own.
I must be from the north side because I grew up on County Line Road. So I was on that road where north of me was Nassau County. So yeah, I must be North Amityville.
That's what I'm talking about. And so am I. And so am I. Listen, let's jump right into it. And I know that I am out kicking my coverage when I talk about legal matters, but I really think this is an important conversation because there's so much going on in our world, politically, socially, and we as believers really have to be well attuned to what God expects from us as we navigate this really difficult circumstance, or these circumstances that we're in. Let's start from the beginning. I want to throw this out there, and Josh, you can answer it as well. But Orlan, should believers be involved in political issues?
That's probably one of the big questions that our church has been fighting with. And to be honest, I'm not sure what the fight is all about. You know, if the Bible has told us that we're supposed to be the salt of the earth and we're supposed to be the light of the world, how can you do so if you never go out and interact with people? You know, salt doesn't do a whole lot sitting in the salt shaker on the table. So if you don't get it in the mix, you don't really, you know, make a difference. So in my opinion, I don't think it's just something that we do. I think it's something that's essential. And I also believe that the world wants to hear from us. So when we fail to go out and be involved, we're not just cheating ourselves and cheating our church. I think we're also cheating individuals who could be learning from us as well. So I think that's part of the job.
You know, I would go even a step further, Teddy, and I'd ask Orlan, what exactly is politics? And, you know, how do you even define politics? Because I find that term to be very vague, or could have a wide perspective.
Well, I think it's supposed to be vague. I'll tell you a funny story. When I first started working on the Obama campaign, I was sitting in some meetings for a couple of weeks, and guys eventually came to me and they said, "Man, you look really comfortable with this. Have you ever done this before?" And I was like, "Nah." They said, "You've never worked on a campaign like this?" I was like, "Never." They said, "Well, how are you so comfortable with it?" I was like, "Man, there's politics in my church that would make this look like child's play." And there was a whole lot of truth to it. I saw things, and just growing up in the church, seeing how people move things around, and how you basically had to be nimble and flexible at all times, that the politics I actually saw that people define as politics actually didn't seem that aggressive to me. And I think a big part of it is just politics is really picking a corner that you're comfortable with, understanding what the issues are there, and being willing to advocate for those positions in a reasonable way. I mean, I've worked for Democrats and I've worked for Republicans, you know, so I've actually been in both neighborhoods. And to be honest, I don't see them a whole lot different from a practical standpoint. Policy standpoint, big differences. But from a practical standpoint, the most important thing for most politicians is getting reelected. You know, people would like to think that the most important thing is them taking care of their constituencies and doing the best thing. But the first order of business, in order to be good at what you need to do, you have to understand what actually motivates people. And if you can't figure out what motivates people, then you're not going to be able to do a good job for the individuals that you're representing. So if I go into the room with the idea that I'm coming in here to make an argument to demonstrate how this individual can help his people, I'm probably not being as effective as I could be if I go in and make that argument. But in addition, I'm explaining why this is probably going to lead to re-election, then I'm probably going to get a lot more people paying attention to what I'm saying.
Right. And I want us to spend time looking at, yes, okay, so we should be involved, but what is the appropriate way to get involved? And so check this out. I looked up this information on something called social gospel, and I just want to present it so that our listeners, our viewers will know what we're talking about. According to Merriam-Webster, the social gospel is defined as it's the application of Christian principles to social problems, one, and number two, it was a movement as a noun. It was a movement in the American Protestant Christianity, especially in the first part of the 20th century, to bringing the social order into conformity with Christian principles. Okay, so straight up, what is right, what is wrong with this? Is this good or is this bad?
Well, I think, first of all, the gospel is social. I mean, you know, the preaching the gospel to the kingdom, going out and meeting people where they are, in my opinion, that's as social as it gets. The gospel doesn't operate inside some box that you pull out from time to time when it's essential. The gospel is going out and telling people about the good news, which means I've got to tell you about it. I got to communicate to you in a way that makes sense. I have to be willing to live it in a way where it's believable when you hear it from me. So all of these aspects of the gospel, to me, inquires and connects in being social. And if you look at the life that Jesus lived on this earth, Jesus did as much preaching as he did social activities, whether it would be going out and feeding people or healing people or helping individuals, young children, explaining how important little children were, demonstrating that woman could be a big part of what his ministry was going to be. So in my opinion, I don't think you can divorce the gospel from the social aspect of life, because to me, all Jesus did on this earth was engage in what I would call social activities, social liberties, looking out for those who have been disenfranchised. We think about him healing the sick. We have to remember that back in those days, the sick were basically ostracized. They were told to get out, go away. But here's Jesus searching them out and then bumping into him sometimes just by accident. And he would do something that would change their lives just by his presence. One of the things we were listening in a lot of services today is your ability to be available. To me, that is the gospel. That is the gospel.
It is interesting, Teddy, that, the aversion to social gospel, or even the term politics, is sometimes a way that we use those terms to avoid dealing with things that we find uncomfortable. So we just quickly label it as politics. I'm not comfortable with this issue, therefore I can qualify it as political so I don't have to deal with it. But there may be other issues that are just as political, but it is something that I get excited about. So, for example, you may have an aversion to issues about race, but then you're passionate about religious liberty. Both issues involve politics and social issues, but one you're more comfortable with, so you don't label it as politics, and the other one you're uncomfortable with, so you want to label it as politics.
Yeah,
Right.
That's right.
And Orlan, you were recently speaking about the dangers of stepping our feet into certain arenas, politically or issue-based arenas, and the danger of doing that. And I wish I could, if you have the time, to just speak to that. What is the danger? What am I getting myself into by choosing some issues and then turning a blind eye to others?
Well, I think first of all, your heart's got to determine what you believe. One of the tough things about politics is people generally have a lot of conflicting beliefs. There's certain principles that they believe, but then if they carry those principles to the nth degree, there should be other things they would do. But because they're uncomfortable with the end game, then they start messing around at the beginning of the process. But I also believe that you need to find out what your actual gifts are. Not everybody's gift is to be out speaking on political issues and representing a group of individuals, because there's nothing worse than individuals who don't really know what they're supposed to say and what they're supposed to do, and don't have a form of consistency that protects us. One of the toughest things that I do when I'm in the area of public affairs and religious liberty, and we're doing Sabbath accommodations, and I'm going in and I'm talking to some employer saying, well, listen, this individual wants to have the Sabbath off because they're a 7-day Adventist. And then they come back to me and say, well, I got 3 other Adventists here and they work every Saturday. What's the problem? I can't start throwing people under the bus and start saying, well, they're just bad Adventists. Say, well, they all, are allowed to kind of view their religion in the way that they see it, how God speaks to them. But it would be so much easier for me to do my job if folk were consistent in what they do. Because you can always be an example or a disciple, but it doesn't always mean it has to be audible. Just live the life of Christ, and that in and of itself tells your story. But sometimes when you have to go explain how you're living the life of Christ, there's times that sometimes you use words that offend people. You use phrases that basically cause people to turn you off. And just imagine, Teddy, that if you and I met and I was the only Christian or the first Christian you ever met in life, and I said something or did something to offend you, you're probably never looking for the second Christian to meet. Right. So the responsibility to do this is high because you become the front porch of Jesus. And if you blow it early on, nobody comes back to your house.
Right. And I think that underlies the really important standard of being connected with Christ. Because think about it. If we try to represent Christ without a real relationship, without a real abiding Gospel of John type of relationship with Christ, then we're going to be a misrepresentative of his truth. And we see that. And I want to speak to that later, because in this definition, in point number 2, right? Mm-hmm. A movement in American Protestant Christianity, especially in the 20th century, but I think now in the 21st century, to bring the social order into conformity with Christian principles. Isn't that speaking to what we're seeing certain evangelicals doing right now, where they appear to be trying to order at least this country, the United States political system, in alignment with their interpretation of biblical morals and principles? And is that dangerous?
Well, that's very dangerous because, we are a country where we have thousands of religions. Mm-hmm. And we are a country where we are supposed to be looking out for the faith and the beliefs of all Americans, not just the larger groups, not just the ones that are the loudest voices. So whenever you start talking about, conforming groups as it relates to religious practices, what you are really doing is starting to step on the toes and infringe upon religion and violating, I guess, what some people will call the Establishment Clause, because if I come in and reshape your religion, then I'm actually creating a religion. Mm-hmm. And government is not supposed to come in and reshape your religion or create a new religion. But part of the responsibility of being a religious individual is to live your life in such a way where the government doesn't have to get involved. Perfect example, divorce. Part of the reason that the government is involved in divorce is because the way the church used to handle divorce was a mess.
Right.
The way if you were in tight with this person, then you could get a divorce. If you cut a big enough check for that person, then you could get an annulment. And how were the individuals who are going to be treated as a result of this divorce going to be taken care of or not taken care of? So when church doesn't do their job right, it actually opens up the door for government to come in to protect its citizens, because sometimes the religious organizations have not protected them in the way that the government sees fit. So it does become a tricky situation, but conformity is something we've got to be careful with, because us, for example, Seventh-day Adventists, there's 1.2 million Adventists in the whole North American division, which means probably about 1 million of them in the United States. Well, there's 8 million Mormon in the United States. There's 12 million Jehovah's Witness across the United States and other parts of the world. 30 million Southern Baptists, 70 million Catholic, and 1 million of us. If we start playing a conformity game and a numbers game, we lose every time. The reason we can punch above our weight class right now is because we come and we partner with individuals. We bring things to the table like our healthcare and our academic institutions. We look a lot bigger than we really are. And we provide the type of services where people are willing to tolerate us. But if we start to get into pushing and shoving based on conforming and based on numbers, if the whole world decides tomorrow, let's pick one day to go to church, I can tell you without hesitation, it's not going to be Saturday.
Agreed. Now, because I know time is short, I want to throw some things at you guys. As our viewers know, a lot has been going on in our world, politically, or should I say socially. So there are a few laws or happenings that are occurring that I just want to throw out there, and I want to hear your response for how we organizationally, but also individually should respond to them. Let me bring up the first one, which I think deals with the voting rights, or the voting, what I call the voting restrictions bill of Georgia. Let's just look at some of the bullet points, and this is CNN that I pulled these from. But the voter ID requirements are for absentee ballots. There's limited ballot drop-off boxes. It's a crime to approach voters in line to give them food or water. Empower state officials to take over local election boards, which means that if those state officials don't like how the election turned out on some level at the local level, they can have influence and power over that, and prohibit Secretary of State's offices from sending unsolicited absentee ballots. Okay, that's a lot. If I don't like this law, which I personally don't, as a believer individually, but also as an organization, how should we respond to that?
Well, I think there's two ways you respond to it. One, as an individual. As an individual, you should always be out expressing what your personal point of view is. If you think that based on your community that you live in, that somebody has reached in to make your life more difficult as it relates to exercising your franchise to vote, you personally should be out there talking about this. But this is the issue with a lot of this stuff, Teddy. If you look back, and probably a lot of people don't dig into the history of America, when George Washington was first elected president of the United States, only 6% of the population could even vote. Mm-hmm. If you didn't own land, if you weren't 21 years old, you couldn't vote. To take it a step further, all white men in America couldn't vote for about 85 years, in which North Carolina was the last state that signed off to allow white men of any reason, no matter what your value was, whatever. So think about that. The United States almost went 100 years where all white men couldn't vote. So from the very beginning, this whole concept was not to find more people to vote. This country was based on controlling things by finding fewer people to vote. Now, a lot of people don't want to have that conversation, but this is part of the fabric of who we have been. The laws in the South that were stopping people from voting was to do so to shrink the number. And if I can shrink the number, then I can control better who I want in power. Mm-hmm. All Georgia is doing is trying to, in the most subtle way possible, continue, in my opinion, to keep that same thought process moving forward. And the bigger problem is, Teddy, is that America is getting more brown, getting more liberal. So the same way we were talking about the numbers as Adventists, the numbers, if you are a white man in America, is shrinking as well from a percentage standpoint. Mm-hmm. So if I'm shrinking from a percentage standpoint, the only thing I can hope in order to maintain power is to take your power away from you so that now my power can still seem larger. Mm-hmm. So I think you always have to push back against anybody taking something from you that you believe. But I think you also have to understand that this has always been the fabric of America. This was never supposed to be equality. This was never supposed to be, everybody gets to vote, because the country was set up on the foundation of we don't really want that. And so I think as an individual, you have to push back. Now, when it gets tricky is when you have to try doing things as an organization. Because see, if we as an organization start to engage in what would deem to be partisan politics, in other words, politics that is favoring one party over another, then we run the risk of running afoul of federal laws, potentially losing our nonprofit status. And you may say, well, no, this is voting. Everybody votes. But the reality is there's some laws that are out there that people see you on one side or the other, you are automatically tagged that you must be liberal or you must be conservative. And if you're liberal, you must be Democrat. If you're conservative, you must be Republican. And therefore, you're engaged in partisan politics, and that's a violation of the law. So individuals can do a lot, but organizations, in particular, our types of organizations, have to be very tricky as it relates to the separation of church and state.
So it's interesting you said, Orlan, about the misconception of the origins of the United States. we like to put the United States as the beacon of democracy, and the foundation of freedom. But the essence of democracy was supposed to be, it's about the battle of ideas. You know, you're supposed to be able to pitch your vision and your idea to the people and not be afraid to defend it against the other side, because you believe you have the convincing argument, so that when it goes to the people, you're going to believe that you're going to win because you have the better idea. But what you're seeing now is maybe what was always there, but maybe they're just not hiding it anymore, is that it was really not a battle of an idea. It's a matter of maintaining power. And you even see the slip up now where people say what they're supposed to be thinking on the inside, on the outside. It's not about the quantity of votes, it's about the quality of votes, which means I want to be able to pick who gets to vote to decide who gets to maintain power. So it's not even really about the battle of ideas. It's not really about maintaining the core tenets of democracy, which then actually leads us into our beliefs in prophecy,
Right.
where right from the beginning, our founding fathers of the Adventist faith used to go out and preach an unpopular message that said, you see this United States? It is the lamb-like beast, because it speaks like it believes in democracy, but it's full of it because, it's full. It does not really promote the tenets of democracy.
Well, and to be honest, the tough part of all of this is in a capitalist society where it's about winners and losers, the easiest way to demonstrate who the winners are is to point out who the losers are. And so when you are in that type of environment, I don't even have to do anything but to make clear who's less than me, and that automatically means I won. And that's why you're always finding there's some group that has to be the boogeyman. There's some group that has to be there. I mean, without getting too crazy, even poor white Americans have been taught that your whiteness has a certain value, that even if you have nothing, at least you're not black. What I mean? So even in that whole area, and those individuals to some degree have been socialized in some areas to vote against things that could help them as poor whites, because it might actually help black people as well. And these are some of the real challenges of our country. And believe you or not, I mean, listen, I love America. I wouldn't want to be anyplace else. I understand our shortcomings and our strengths. And so, I still probably would cry when I hear the national anthem. I mean, that's who I am, but I'm not confused as to what the real rules are here and how this works. And I think that's what we have to understand when you get out into this arena. If you're going out there making noise and trying to figure out when are we going to start being on a level playing field, and, your half of the sandwich and my half of the sandwich are going to look alike, you fight that fight, I think you're wasting your time. If you go and make clear, I am behind, and I'm always going to be behind. I just want to make sure that every now and then while you're in a rest station, I can keep running. But they're never going to let me run till I catch you. That's just not going to happen. We're running a 100-yard dash, and I only got to run 40 of it. I don't care if you're Usain Bolt. I still probably going to beat you. And that's the reality of things.
And that's diametrically opposed to maybe the younger generations, because I hate to put it out there, but we're all middle-aged men on some level. All that we need is a pair of members-only jackets and some penny loafers to complete the outfit, I'm sure. But there are younger people who don't see it that way, and they are pushing for lack of a better term, equality. I don't know if that's it.
Well, but to be honest, Teddy, they should be pushing for it, because they have actually lived in a different America than us. Mm-hmm. I was telling my son, one day, I said, when I was growing up, I don't ever remember a white kid sleeping over my house. Mm-hmm. My kids have had white kids, Asian kids, Hispanic kids. I mean, every type of, nationality I can think of has probably spent time here at our house, spent the night, our kids at their house. It is a different world. I didn't necessarily grow up that way. So the idea that they are now growing up with different points of view because of what they live in is understandable. And all I can do is share my experiences with them, but I can't cause them to think they've got to believe like me and feel me because of my experiences, because there is a different world that they live in. And that's why even when you see the Black Lives Matter and all of these marches that are happening right now, there's a very different group of people that are out there marching. And that's because there's a group that has grown up very different, and they have friends now that don't look like them that they've known since kindergarten. And they love those individuals and want to do something about it.
And here's the interesting thing. Society will tell them, the Bible is antiquated. If you want to push for this new world, this new paradigm, you got to throw away some of the old things. But I would challenge them to say some of the more radical positions about equality and even equity, you can find the roots of that in the Bible. I mean, if you go into Leviticus and Deuteronomy and look at those rules about the rule of Jubilee, about how even once God gives you this land, he's like, let's be clear, you don't own this land.
Right.
You did nothing to take ownership of this land. So here are the rules. I don't care how much wealth you've amassed, how much power you got. At some point, this property is going to be reverted back to the dude, no matter how much in debt he is, how much he has to put himself and his family in bondage. There's a time when everything gets restored back to zero.
Right. We set the board back to zero.
Yeah.
So that's God is a God of justice.
In light of the capitalistic mindset we have here in the U.S.
I mean, there's no way that all of a sudden Elon Musk is told 25 years from now, you got to go back to where you were. I mean, it's just not going to happen, man. They say if Bill Gates had Oprah Winfrey's money, he would cry, and that's the society that we live in. And that's the politics we live in. And remember, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was a church that was built and initiated here in the United States of America. So it's the fabric of who we are as a people, which means it's also the fabric of who we are as a church. And our church has gone from side to side and up and down, the liberal and whatever. I mean, we go from the first president of the General Conference being somebody who was hiding slaves as part of the Underground Railroad to, and I won't say anything negative, but I will simply say that's not what happens anymore. And the purpose and the thoughts of what we believe we need to do as a people, sometimes you want to be more comfortable in the grand scheme of the world that you live in, as opposed to being that peculiar person that God has called us.
All right, let me hit you guys with this one because I know that our time is running short and I want to respect your time. I am not a fan of marijuana, not at all. Maybe for medicinal use, not for smoking it because of obviously the carcinogen of smoking and all that stuff. But our societies, many of them, our states now, because we live in the DMV, and just I think this past week, one of our neighboring states passed and signed, and I think governor approval as well, a marijuana type bill that allows for it to be used recreationally. What is this big fascination with marijuana? Do you guys know? Can you explain it to me?
I'm gonna be honest with you, man. I'm a New Yorker. The idea of spending my money on stuff that gets blown up in smoke has just never been a concept I could understand. I mean, maybe it's the cheapness of who I was, or I didn't have enough bad stuff going on in my life that I needed to feel like I needed to be separated from reality. But, but in the same breath, the other side of this argument is you've got a lot of black and brown people who've been thrown in jail for extended periods of time for having small possessions of marijuana. Now, that's not the life I want to live, but this is also part of the social message, and I'm supposed to look out for my brethren who are being oppressed in some way. So if now all of a sudden, 1 ounce of marijuana puts you in jail for 10 years, but 1 ounce of cocaine doesn't put you in jail at all, then somebody has to step in. So part of what's going on with this whole marijuana thing is not even so much just the drug and the smoking and the impact of it. It's also about the social justice of people who are being punished in an absorbent way for engaging in what people would call a small act that maybe you and I wouldn't want to engage in at all. But the fact that you are engaging in it, does that mean that you should be treated in an extremely harsh way as it relates to a punishment? And I think that's part of what's trying to be addressed here. So that's the balance of what's going on. Obviously, our church doesn't believe in it, but there are things we have to do to try to help people be protected.
And let me clarify, Josh, before you jump in. I am against the usage of marijuana to get high, whether smoking it or eating it. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Josh.
No, you're right. And Orlan's right. There's all those corollary issues about the inequitable treatment. Even before we started decriminalizing the possession, the statistics show that for the most part, if white folks were caught with it or had a problem, it was more of a rehabilitation. Let's treat the addiction. Whereas for Black folks, it was more of we need to incarcerate for the problem. But I think the thing that we have to be careful of is, if you notice, what happens is there a movement where secular society tries to redefine what sin is. And this is where it becomes tricky when society tries to tell you what is sin is no longer sin. And then you sometimes find even some of the young people falling into that because they are being inundated with that message from society that this is no longer sin. Yep. So whether we move for criminalization or decriminalization, people are finding it's a way to make money. Let's not kid ourselves. That is actually, to me, the big probably influencer of this movement. But at the same time, that is where you have to start to remember, as Orlan said, if you're supposed to be salt, that means you're supposed to be distinct. So when society starts to say these behaviors are no longer sin, and then society accepts that, how are we going to stand and be different?
Right. And I know that I'm middle-aged man again. I should rename the show Middle-Aged Man, Get Off My Lawn, Stop Smoking Your Marijuana.
Stop smoking it,
right. And I don't want a marijuana brownie.
Literally told our kids. I mean, we used to be scared. I remember when we had a Supreme Court nominee that had to withdraw his name because they had a picture of him smoking a blunt.
Yeah.
But nowadays, I mean, come on.
Yeah, it doesn't even register, man. It's not even, and that's the sad thing, that, we still have to teach our young people, what to do. Because even with this law, for example, in Virginia, you're not supposed to be driving with it, okay? So now somebody pulls you over, they smell marijuana, and you still got big problems, You're supposed to be able to grow up to 4 plants in your house where nobody can see you. So now you grow 6 plants. What happens? You go to jail? I mean, all of this stuff is so nuanced, and you still are probably going to see certain people who are going to be benefit in ways that others will not. And there will also be people who are not going to get penalized in the same way. And that's the bigger problem with all of this. But at the end of the day, this is something we know that's not helping you in any way from a health perspective. And, there was a time you couldn't buy alcohol in this country legally.
That's right.
When the people speak, things change.
Right. Here's another pitch to throw at you guys. The Equality Act. I want you to speak on this one. Just a couple of bullet points. It bans discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And under Title 11, if I'm reading my Roman numerals correct, 6. Thank you very
Title
much.
6.
Right. My editor in the back was like, 6, man, 6 of the Civil Rights Act. Institutions that engage in racial discrimination can be barred from receiving federal funds. The Equality Act would extend that provision to cover the discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And there was a quote in here, I think, Josh, from one of your coworkers or your cohorts, Todd McFarlane.
Yeah, one of my colleagues.
Yeah, last paragraph here where he talks about how impactful it would have been on his school, on his church, on his ability as an individual to get Pell Grants or student loans to go to college. Can you guys speak to this one for us? What is going on with this act? What is its relevance and significance?
Well, the whole purpose of the Equality Act is to try to put something in place to help to protect individuals of the LGBTQ community that are basically being oppressed. So, for example, most people probably may not even know this, in 29 states in our country right now, if you fall into this category and you live in a housing complex, they can ask you to move out simply because of that.
Because of your sexual orientation?
Sexual orientation.
Okay.
Legal, nothing can be said. 29 states, if that's how you do, get out. Now, what this act is trying to do is say, that's just not right. You shouldn't be allowed to do that to us. And therefore, the group that is being responsible for pushing this agenda is saying, maybe what we ought to do is put our community inside the same rules and regulations that protected the African American community and women. And so if we are treated as a protected class in that way, then we will be in a situation now where the world will have to treat us the same way and the same penalties will apply. Now, the problem with all of this is, and this is where being the messenger, you have to be very nuanced. You cannot go out and decide to just tell everybody, well, listen, our church believes this. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't care about any of the issues. Forget about them. No matter what happens to them, that's their problem. Well, that can't be what Christ would say. That can't be what we should be doing, because we're supposed to love our fellow man no matter what. Our issue with the Equality Act is there certain provisions in there that would not protect us as a church and our church organizations.
That's right.
We don't want to come in and say that you ought to treat the LGBT community in a very negative way. What we're saying is, don't allow your protection of them to now infringe upon our rights to the point where now we are being oppressed or put upon. So
how
we
would
want
that
to
happen?
Things change. Well, part of the way that happens is that once you start to violate federal laws, there are certain things that the church now will not be able to do. So, for example, we'll say, well, the church doesn't get federal funds anyway. Well, yes, we do. What would our tithe and offering look like if all of a sudden our people aren't allowed to write that off on their taxes? That's getting something from the government. What would our institutions look like if our students can no longer get federal grants to go to Adventist schools because that is a church organization and this is federal funds? And to take it even one step further, what happens if some of our academic institutions are now told that your boards are not diverse enough and we need somebody from the LGBTQ community to be on your board, or else we're not going to continue to accredit you as an institution? None of us on this call are sending our children to non-accredited Adventist schools. Not going to happen. So what's happening is that this pressure to actually put us in a position where we will now get hemmed up as it relates to federal funds because we don't allow certain things to happen. So at our Adventist school, we have rules and regulations regarding how that community can act at our schools. But now if we say that you can't live a certain way at our school, or certain people can't be hired at our school, or certain individuals can't be pastors because of their lifestyle, they could now use the law through the Equality Act to start clubbing us and telling us that we have to make that change. That's the problem.
So Orlan, talk to us a little bit about what that means to be a protected class in the eyes of the law.
Yeah, so if you're a protected class in the eyes of the law, for all intents and purposes, there's a whole list of things that you just get automatic protections for. You can't just simply now have people push against you without there being, any particular penalties that come from that activity. And what ends up happening is that they are actually set by statute. So you don't even have to go and actually negotiate what the penalties are going to be. You treat a certain individual a certain way in which you're violating Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, then bang, this is what you're going to get hit with. You're going to get hit from a federal standpoint. You're going to get hit from other standpoints. And there's one thing interesting I'll tell you about, my brothers and sisters of the Mormon Church. For a very long time, that was a church that was talking about that Black people would not go to heaven. Mm-hmm. But in 1975, when the federal government said, that's a cool thought, you can keep that, but guess what? You're not going to write off no more taxes if that's what you believe. Well, Black people now can go to heaven as far as they're concerned, because when the feds come in and start shaking things around, it makes a big difference. And I'll throw even one more thing out at you. You take an organization in the world church, and people hate to talk about this, but ADRA. ADRA is probably funded 95% by federal government funds. If we didn't get federal funds to run ADRA, there would be no ADRA. And ADRA may be one of the, what I would call, porch of the Adventist church organizations that has more impact on a worldwide basis maybe than anything else that we do. And it's funded by over 90% and probably even over 95% by federal government funds. And if you were doing that, you lose.
And just to chime in, ADRA, and you guys correct me, ADRA means Adventist Disaster Relief Association?
Correct. The ones that go all over the world whenever there's a disaster, and we come in and try to take care of people, bring resources. I mean, it's probably one of the greatest operations our church runs, to be honest.
Don't get me in trouble. Adventist Development and Relief Association.
Yeah, that's why you're here. That's why you're here.
No, but I think, one of the interesting points that I remember having a discussion with one of my professors in law school, and we were having a conversation, and someone tried to point out, well, why should Black folks be treated a little bit differently or be classified as a protected class as opposed to, for example, Jewish folks? And he tried to say, they have a history of discrimination as well. The one thing that stuck with me that my professor brought up is that discrimination is based on identification. In order for me to discriminate against you, Teddy, I have to be able to identify who you are. Mm-hmm. All right. And so a lot of folks try to say, well, what's the difference? What's the difference? Jews historically were able to decide that they were not going to show that they were Jewish. And so they got into a lot of doors that were traditionally closed to Jewish folks because they didn't broadcast that they were Jewish. But, unlike Jewish folks who did go through discrimination as Italians, as the Irish did, I could speak proper English. I could change my wardrobe. I could take up polo and golf, but guess what? They will always be able to identify me no matter how hard I will try. Mm-hmm. Same with women. So the thing that people have to understand when they classify protected classes, some of these classes were based on easy identification, which perpetuated the discrimination that they faced. And so, although we want to make sure that we protect the rights of other folks, we have to be honest in the dialogue that not all of these classes of folks that are experiencing discrimination are going through the same experience as African Americans have had in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Understood. Now, our time in our last one thing, or our last thing that I'll throw at you guys, of course, I'm saving the hardest one for last, I think. I'm not sure. We just had a verdict passed down on the Derek Chauvin case, and now there's a huge push to pass legislation that deals with police brutality or some of the tactics used by police across the nation. I'm trying to understand for the believer that wants to be a Matthew 25 type of believer. Let me explain that for those that may not know. It's the part in the gospel where Christ really identifies succinctly his expectation of us to help people that are in need and that are, and I know it's not a popular word to use, but oppressed on some level. If I'm a believer that is interested in helping the oppressed and I engage with these political movements to address police reform on some level, can you guys give me some guardrails or just give me some admonition, some advice on how I should look at this so that I'm approaching it appropriately and within a reasonable Christian morality or behavior? I know that always the long questions are the wrongest questions. Sorry.
But let me just put it to you this way. There's going to be pushing and shoving whenever somebody wants change. You know, the idea that power will ever cede quietly is a fallacy. So the idea that there's going to be a nice, genteel, appropriate way to do any of this stuff is probably not realistic. Now, let's take a look at all of this. There are a ton of laws that are basically written by the federal government regarding police brutality. There's Title VI that just tells you if somebody does this, you know, you can do that. They've got all these rules that talk about excessive force, and these are federal laws that cut across everything. Problem is, Supreme Court puts out a ruling, and in that ruling, it says that you still have to be able to look at each action through the reasonable eyes of the police officer under those set of circumstances. So now even if they've used excessive force, and the Supreme Court said, and you don't get to go back and do hindsight is 2020. We're only going to look at this at the Supreme Court saying this based on what would have been the reasonable interpretation of what a cop should have done under those set of circumstances. So there you go. You got the rules that say what's supposed to happen. You got the Supreme Court that gives you this new interpretation, and this new interpretation they give you, you can drive a hole through it. Why? Because the system is set up where the police officers and the prosecutors and the judges are all part of one system.
That's right.
And therefore, all the rules and regulations that you put in place, if you're in a situation like Donald Trump, where you just put in 200 new federal judges during your time when you were in office, those are the people who are going to decide whether or not there was something reasonable that the police officer did under those circumstances. And a lot of those people can relate to what the police officer did. And even us here, if somebody said, hey, Orlan, you got a gun, you're out in the dark, all of a sudden you think the other dude has a gun, you pull out your gun and drop him, then you find out he doesn't have a gun, then they're going to be like, but was Orlan's action reasonable under the circumstances because it was dark and there's a lot of crime in that area? Then all of a sudden they come back and say, you know what? Oh, we'd have shot a brother too. And then once they conclude that, everybody goes home.
Right. No, I think you're right. One of the things I remember processing in law school was the law is not what you read on paper. The law is what the majority of the judges at the Supreme Court says they want the law to mean. And so if you're trying to decide really what position you take, Teddy, I would push people to look at the Jesus method that people talk about. What was Jesus's position when he walked on the earth? Was it to maintain the power of the rich and the powerful? Or was it to go and attend to those who were less fortunate and the downtrodden and those who had no power? I think, in fact, I think he was very controversial because he would go to the very people that was in the inside said you don't associate with those people. You don't take up the cause of the Samaritan woman that's at the well with 5 husbands.
I mean, Teddy, this is one of those things that people would be shocked. Probably a third of the cases where police are actually in court, they get convicted. But the problem is there's probably tens of thousands of cases that should have gone to court that don't go. So of the cases that finally do get in court, a third of them get convicted. But even the ones that ended up in court, 2/3 of them still walk away. And that still doesn't talk about the tens of thousands that never show up in court.
Right.
So, the system is set up in a way where people like policing. They believe it makes them feel safe. And they don't want police to do anything less. Hey, if you and I got somebody breaking into our house and we call 911, we're not expecting somebody to come over there being all nice and genteel. We're expecting somebody to come over there and club somebody if they need to.
That's
and that's
right.
what we're expecting. But the question is, how do you balance what you want them to do to protect you and still not step forward in a way where they're infringing upon people who look like you? Because you, me, we have to go out and tell our sons different things about what you do when you're in a car that a lot of other people don't have to do because he's a black man behind a wheel, and police officers believe that they have the power to really be reasonable, and what they call reasonable, I'm probably not calling reasonable. But the judges out there probably are.
So you're saying it's nuanced again, Orlan, right?
Yes.
You can't just say we don't want public safety because we know that this world is sinful. We don't want predators or knuckleheads to just be walking up and taking our stuff, breaking into our house. But that doesn't mean that it should be all or nothing. It shouldn't be either I want safety at any price and to trample on anybody's rights, or it's the complete opposite where, well, we just gonna let everything go because we don't want to get in trouble.
I mean, Teddy, so much of this is the words. When I started hearing people talk about, all right, the way we want to deal with the police is we're going to use this phrase, defund the police. The moment I heard that phrase, I knew we were dead on arrival.
Crazy.
Dead on arrival. Because that is a messaging that the other side will use and say, these people don't even want to have police. They want to defund them. And when I would say to people, why are you saying that? That's not what you really mean. But their view is, well, it doesn't really matter. They know what we mean. I'm like, no. Words make a difference. And that whole defund the police thing was dead on arrival because not even reasonable people want the police to be defunded. What they want them to just be is in a position where they are acting better. If they're there to protect and serve, then please protect and serve, as opposed to show up and beat. And that is what's been, the struggle with these nuanced issues again. But you can have all the great laws that you want. But if the judges that are basically interpreting these laws are part of the same club, you're still out to lunch, man.
Right. Now, our time is up, and I appreciate you guys taking your time to share this valuable information. Hopefully there will be a part 2 if I can convince you guys to come back on, because the next part must be, what are the actions that we can take? I particularly want to talk about the functional, what can we do? I've seen, and just while I have you, I'd be foolish if I let you go without at least taking a stab at it. Like, if I'm Joe and I'm sitting at home right now and I'm like, yeah, I want to speak up against this or that. What are some of the things, the low-hanging fruit things that you've seen successful that people have done to not be silent in the face of things that they see that are incorrect or that are unjust?
Well, I think first of all, people have to understand that you can be impactful in small circles. There's sometimes this view that if I'm not out there making a big splash, or I'm not sitting down with a governor or the president or somebody else. I mean, the fact of the matter is everything gets done in small circles. Make an impact in whatever concentric circle you're in. If it's your neighborhood, if it's the street that you live on, talk to folk, live your life a certain way, and allow them to wonder what it is about you that would interest them. Don't act like things aren't happening when they are, but you don't necessarily have to be out burning down a building in order to make your point. But, I try to tell people, just make an impact wherever you are. Know enough to be able to discuss it. Not everybody's a warrior. Not everybody's an orator. Not everybody should be out there, but we all should be living our life in a way that people know what we stand for. And to me, that's the first order of business. Live your life. Even if you never said a word, they should be able to look at you. I mean, what does the Bible say? They know we are Christians by our lives. And if we are living our life a certain way, then to me, that's going to be the first step in order to start to make a difference.
All right. Josh?
Now, I would say, there's that axiom that became popular during the whole after 9/11. If you see something, say something. I think that applies, and I think one of the stories that really struck a nerve for me in the whole Derek Chauvin trial was the ordinary people who didn't just walk by and say, "This is not my business."
Right.
It was the ordinary people who said, "I see injustice happening in front of me, and I'm not going to walk away." And their decision point at that point made the biggest difference. And then also what we saw this past summer, when society got up and said, "This is unacceptable." It didn't matter that you had these stronghold institutional mechanisms that were supposed to suppress this kind of stuff from reaching some kind of culpability. The fact that society rose up, the fact that people said, "No, I'm going to stand and and take a stand," resulted in something that we've never seen before. Amen. A cop got held accountable for his murder.
Amen. Thank you so much. This is the end of our episode, but Josh, I want you to bless our audience, please, with a prayer, just so that God will use us and we'll be so connected with him so that we'll know what to do based off what he tells us to do. That's in line with the biblical principles that we espouse as Christians and as a denomination, and as well as elders of our incredible church.
All right, let us pray. Dear, kind, and gracious Heavenly Father, we are so grateful to you that you loved us even while we were yet sinners. But you've given us a simple command that we would demonstrate love so that the world will know and will be drawn to you. And so we ask that you will transform our hearts and our minds. We ask you that you will allow us to be the salt that you have called us to be, because there is a world that is dying, that is desperate, and that is looking for truth and light. So use us in our sphere of influence to demonstrate what it's like to have Christ in our hearts and to be attractive to the world so that they will be drawn to you and that we may bring so many souls into this kingdom. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much. My name is Teddy Allen. Our co-host was Josh Pierre, and our special guest, Brother Orlan Johnson. Thank you, guys. We appreciate it. God bless you. Please, before you go, subscribe. Just hit the subscribe button, share and like. And if you want to see more episodes, you can see them on our website. I'll just flash that screen. Essential Dialogues with Teddy Allen. Hit me with an email. It was predicted that we may get some email on this. So if you have an email to send, you might as well send it to this address, essentialdialoguesta@gmail.com. And we thank you so much for joining us. God bless you.
I'm about to subscribe right now, Teddy.
Thank you very much. Please subscribe right now. Orlan?
Oh, yeah. Me
too. On that note, take care, everyone.